So, Drake, I'm going to put off a couple of bullet points this year. Number one, and this is important for especially even veteran auction drafters, do not get into a bidding war for a player you don't want or don't need.
I love it. Thank you.
Do not do it. Even if you're the most extreme example is getting in a bidding war for a quarterback who, when you already have one and you're like, oh, this quarterback's going for way too cheap, and then you get saddled with them. Because here's two things. Number one, not only is your budget finite, so are your roster spots. You have two forms of currency in an auction draft, and both of them are finite. So if you get saddled with a player you don't want, not only do you have fewer dollars to spend on a player you do want, but you don't even have the room to put that player on your roster because you can't cut a player during an auction draft. It doesn't work that way. So your roster spots and your budget are finite. So don't get into a bidding war for a player you don't want or can't afford just because somebody else gets a value. If somebody else gets a value on a player you don't need, golf clap and move on. Yep. Save your money for maybe getting a value you do need.
What?
Why are you shaking your head? You're welcome.
All across the fantasy universe, welcome everybody to Fantasy Points Now. A little 2-point stance reunion, you could say. It's Brian Drake right here, my man Joe Dolan, managing editor of FantasyPoints.com. And Joe, this show we did a year ago was so popular, so well received on our podcast platform and YouTube, we had to run it back. And we're bringing in our good pal Drew Davenport from Football Guys to talk a little auction. It's going to be exciting. I know you're an auction guy. You do the auction content here at Fantasy Points.
Oh, for sure. It's my favorite way to draft. It's the best way to draft. It's the most exciting draft. It's the draft I look forward to the most every year. And it's because it's unpredictable. And, you know, it makes strategy talk like this with Drew a little bit. It's a little less specific than, you know, your standard values and targets draft, because with those, you're like, well, I know this guy's going to go in the 5th round, or I know this guy is going to be there when I have the 5th pick. With an auction draft, you don't know. And so the strategies kind of carry over from year to year, and then they mold themselves to the market every year. And I usually try to come away with like one key cog of auction strategy every single season. That's kind of just the wheel spoke around which my auction strategy revolves. I've come up with that this year. And I'm excited to kind of just chop it up with you and Drew about like how we approach our auction, or of course, salary cap drafts, which we must throw out there because that's what a lot of the major platforms call it these days.
Yeah, so whether it's auction, whether it's salary cap, however you describe it, it's the same thing, and we love doing it. We have a lot of fun with our buddy Drew Davenport. Give him a follow on X at Drew Davenport FF. He is, of course, a longtime staff writer over at footballguys.com, host of the Auction Brief podcast and the Fantasy Football Lawyer Patreon, and I gotta say, two-time Kings Classic Blended Division auction champion, which really goes to show you guys, Drew puts his money where his mouth is, and to win the Kings Classic is going against the best of the best in fantasy football, and to win it twice is quite a feat. So let's welcome in Mr. Davenport. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing fantastic. I love the introduction because it is easily one of the highlights of my fantasy career to say that I am a 2-time champ in the Kings Classic. That was a lot of fun, took a lot of luck, but a lot of hard work too. So thank you guys for having me again. I had a blast last year. Let's run it back.
Let's do it. And I went through your article series over at Football Guys. It was very well done. And there were a few points that you made over and over again. And as folks get into auction drafting, you know, we don't need to give them the elementary basics. I think they kind of have that if they're listening to this podcast. But where I want to start is you made it a point to say you want to make sure folks are tracking everyone's finances, your own and the room, either on an app, a website, a piece of paper. You know, hopefully the website's doing it for you. But you find that that's where most people go wrong, is because they don't know the room. Maybe they're just paying too much attention to themselves, and then they don't know maybe their own budget. They don't know what the guy across the table has for them. Why is it so important to, you know, have a handle on everybody in the room?
Well, it is. It's absolutely huge because you can't really decide what you're going to do in the direction that you're going to take your draft unless you know exactly what's happening on the other rosters. And I go back to a couple different factors that we're paying attention to. We're paying attention to not only who we've rostered and who's on our team already, how many open spots do we have, but then what does everyone else have? And then also your cap in relation to other people's cap, but also the total cap dollars in the room, finally juxtaposing that with the player pool and the scarcity left in the tiers. So you've got all these factors that are kind of like in this big nebulous ball that you kind of have to bounce off of each other. And you can't possibly know how those factors are affecting the current prices unless you're dialed in to what everybody's doing at every single moment. And I know that sounds tedious and difficult. And a lot of times you're in an online auction, you're going to be able to see that stuff right in front of your face because the website's keeping it for you. But that can't account for position scarcity and things like that. So even if you know, hey, this guy's got this much money left, you still have to be looking at each player's team to say, am I going to be directly competing with that person for certain position groups? Say that person has, oh, they don't have very much money left. They've only got $45 and I've got 100. Well, if they're mostly done with their team and they need a wide receiver too, you're still going to be competing with them for a significantly priced wide receiver too at that point. So you really just, there's no way to succeed at a high level in an auction draft unless you are dialed in on every single manager in the room and what they're doing at that specific time.
You know, like the thing that I like to keep it in mind here, Drake and Drew, I think that's a wonderful point. In order for this to happen, you have to start reading the room right from the get-go. I would venture to guess most auctions I've been in, most but not all, have started with a flurry of bidding. You know, the Christian McCaffreys of the world, the Justin Jeffersons of the world last year, Tyreek Hills, those guys, people are excited to throw their money out there right away. But as Drew said, eventually the resources are going to be finite, and there will always be somebody in your league who sits back. Now, there's a couple things that can happen with that. The person who sits back lets everybody kind of go after each other like piranhas. That person could really start to benefit so long as that person jumps in the right way. And this is what I call this is a key component of my auction plan every year. I just call it the hammer. The person who has the hammer is the person who has the most money. And when you want to be cognizant of who the hammer is, you want to be cognizant of how much money the hammer has, and you want to be cognizant of what open spots are on the hammer's roster. Because the last thing you want to do is get into a point where you can be bullied for a player that you want, bullied for a player that you know the hammer is going to want. That is a good way to end up drafting from behind in an auction, and you do not want to do that.
Yeah, and if I could add something real quick there, excellent point on the hammer, because what ends up happening is you can kind of be scared of what the hammer is going to do. But if you think about it like, hey, that person is saving their money for X, Y, or Z players that are still the top level players on the board. You can sometimes sneak through some lower level players, and the hammer's not going to want to give up their advantage. They're not going to want to dip into that advantage they have. So sometimes you can sneak those low level players through while the hammer is waiting to actually drop the hammer.
Yeah. So that leads to the importance of pre-draft, Drake, whether it's a cheat sheet or whether it's doing a million drafts like I've done so far with Best Ball. And it's hard for Best Ball to not color your vision because that's where you do the majority of your drafts. It's just now applying what I do from Best Ball to auction. And I think somebody like me who does this every day of every week of every year, I don't have a printout. I mean, I put one together, but I don't have a printout cheat sheet in front of me. I have my tiers in my head mentally. But for those of you who are just maybe getting into an auction draft, tiers are so much more important than rankings. It's not even close because this is the tier system is going to operate how you use your budget and how you perceive the rest of the room is going to use their budgets. For instance, let's just say, oh, I've got 2 running backs left in the top tier. let's just say two guys who I like this year are Saquon Barkley and Jonathan Taylor. And they're going in the same tier as Devon Achane. And you want one of those three guys. I'm not saying that I'm endorsing these, but I'm just trying to make an example. I want to be bidding on the first of those guys to go up for auction. Because the reason is, inevitably, anybody in that room who says, I need one of these three running backs, as soon as you get to the last guy to be nominated in that tier, that guy's price is going to get inflated.
Yep.
We've seen it a million times. How many times have you been in a draft where a wide receiver who is consensusly ranked lower than another receiver who went earlier in an auction goes for more money because of positional scarcity? So not just do you want to know where the money in the room is, but you want to know, all right, this guy doesn't have a running back. If I want one of these three running backs who are on the board, I better get bidding sooner rather than later. That's a way to create not just you getting good players, but you saving a few bucks that you can end up using later because the Sharks are going to be out for the final player in that tier.
Yeah, it's a great point. And it leads me, Drew, into what I was going to say about the first 10 nominations set the tone. You're going to find out who's bidding, who's won who, or any values had. And to me, tell me if I'm wrong here, but the first few guys nominated always seem to go at a value. People are excited. Some are nervous, as maybe they're kind of rookie drafters, but let's say you're in a draft room and, for the hell of it, the first pick, Christian McCaffrey goes out and he goes for $55. Okay. And then all of a sudden people are going to go, damn, I got him on my sheet. He was at 60. You know damn well, Drew, when Bijan and Brees come out, they're going to go for more than 55. So to me, it always pays, like, if you can get the first stud on the board, sometimes it works to your advantage.
Yeah, this is a pop culture reference I love to make because it's one that not many people know, but I think it's absolutely hilarious. I was a big Friends fan back in the day, and the short version of the story is Chandler and Joey are playing a made-up card game because Chandler's trying to give him money. And he says, oh my gosh, you have this card and this card. And oh, you're sitting down and I'm going to give you extra money. And he called it the sitting down bonus. And I love this in auctions. The sitting down bonus is almost always there because people just sat down. They have their full cap. And there's something psychological about it. I don't know what it is, but I have it too, where the first player out of the gate, you don't want to just blow $50 of your $200 cap right out of the gate because you like the possibility of what can happen in that draft. So you sit down and you say, I don't really want to spend that. And then, if it's somebody like Amon-Ra St. Brown, who's maybe fifth or sixth on people's boards, they're going to say, now there's too many guys ahead of him. There's a lot of time. I'm not blowing that money. Maybe you get Amon-Ra St. Brown for 38 or 39 or 41. You get that little discount. And what I always stress about top level players, and the reason I love this point, is that there really just aren't deals on top level players. So you just have to get it in your mind. You're probably going to pay market price or above for the elite players, the first and second round guys, and just accept that. But I guess the exception to that is the sitting down bonus at the beginning. People are settling in. They're a little timid. They love their cap. You're going to find some deals right out of the gate.
Joe, would you say, have you seen in drafts, he mentioned a guy like Amon-Ra St. Brown. If you were to throw out, hey, here's the wide receivers that we're going to start off nominating in the first round, maybe it's better to not throw out CD or type, like, don't throw out the name. Throw out like, hey, this guy's in the bottom half of the tier, but he's still great. Like, I'd love to get, Puka Nacua, but maybe he's not going to go for what CD Lamb did. So it's a good point to what Drew just said is, just maybe throw not the guy.
Right. That's again, this all ties into the tiering system, right? It's to know what guys you're comfortable with. Now, for some players, this really isn't going to work. Like this year, really, I only view there as being one player who there is no peer, and that's Christian McCaffrey, right? Bijan Robinson and Brees Hall are in a tier below him. And I don't know if the bidding on Bijan or Brees Hall is going to affect the bidding on Christian McCaffrey, but for a wide receiver tier, I really view there is being this year kind of there's fewer than 12 wide receivers that I feel are like, oh my God, I would love to start my draft with these guys. And those guys are Lamb, Tyreek Hill, St. Brown, as Drew just brought up, Jamar Chase. Those are like the top four. And then there's Justin Jefferson, AJ Brown, Nakua, and Garrett Wilson. So there's really 8 wide receivers who I feel really good about. Throwing somebody out in the middle of those tiers, like for instance, if Garrett Wilson is the first wide receiver to be nominated, I think Drew is 100% right. I feel like there is going to be, it might seem like, oh my, I paid $40 for Garrett Wilson as the first bid, and Tyreek Hill isn't even off the board. But when you realize Tyreek Hill is going to go for 58, then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I've got 18 extra bucks here. I don't have Tyreek, but I have 18 extra bucks that can go to a really good RB2 later in my draft. That's when those little small incremental moves really start to make sense. So it's all about being comfortable drafting from the middle of a tier, because if you're drafting from the middle of a tier early, then maybe later in the draft with the extra $3 that you have that you saved here and there, you're start to able to pluck the top of the tier, or all importantly later in your draft to be able to get the last guy in a tier. I don't want to be the guy to get the last guy in a tier in the early part of my draft, but late in my draft, I want to have the power to be able to get the last guy in a tier, because that's going to separate me from the people who are going to have $1 guys at the end of their roster.
And if I want to make a real quick point here, the one point I want to make about tiers is something that I think people underestimate too. And it's something that I've copped to in the last couple of years, that the tier thing really matters when we talk about the size of the tier as well. Because Joe brought up a good point earlier about if there's a tier of 3 guys, it's going to make the competition for those 3 guys more fierce more quickly, because people are going to say, oh gosh, there's these only couple guys here, I got to go for one of them. But there are some truly massive tiers at RB2 and wide receiver 2 this year. And I'm seeing some tiers that are like 12, 15 guys in one tier. That makes the tiering scarcity change a little bit, because you can afford to kind of relax and say, hey, I'm going to get a couple of guys from these tiers that are so big, and you can sort of wait and say, which one of those guys is it going to be? Oh, here's the deal. I'm going to take that deal. So I think the size of the tiers matters as well.
And I'm over at FantasyPoints.com right now. I have our auction cheat sheet pulled up for our subscribers out there. You can go into the downloads tools, and you can find this in here. We have it for full PPR. We have it for half PPR, super flex. I think Joe did these, and there's a fantastic job. The tiers are all here about how much money we think they're going to go for. So if you need it, it's there. It's printable, ready for you guys to go and dominate your draft later in August. Well, you guys talk about the tiers, and if you get a guy, you save a couple of bucks here and there. This leads me into something that Drew has talked about extensively on his Auction Brief podcast, and I've seen it in practice because I've drafted with Drew in live auction several times, and it's the par sheet. And I see you, and you got a little piece of paper and a pen, and you're writing it down. You're covering it up so other people don't see it. Explain to the audience what the par sheet is and how, having one of those handy is going to help them draft an overall better team.
Yeah, so I wouldn't call this concept controversial, but I would say that I do get some pushback on this concept, and I understand why. Because veteran auction drafters, this is not a concept for Joe Dolan. All right, this guy knows what he's doing. He's done a lot of auctions in his life. I don't necessarily think he needs to have that. I still like to use it because I feel like it's a really nice crutch. It calms me down. It's a psychological thing more than a need thing, because I get partway into the draft and I think, hey, I know where I'm going from here and I can do it. But I think part of what's underestimated, and let me explain what it is, I guess, before I launch into that. But part of what it's underestimated is doing the tier sheet really helps you prepare and helps you in the moment. But the par sheet. The par sheet is really a way for you to try to spend your money in a judicious way. And the reason I say that is because the biggest challenge for auction drafters is not spending too fast, but also spending fast enough that you get enough elite talent on your team. And I always make the analogy for snake drafters. would you go into your draft and trade 3/5 for your first? You wouldn't do that. You want a first round draft pick on your team. You want a second round draft pick on your team. Those level of players need to end up on your squad. Now, I understand there's different ways to build an auction roster, but you have to get some elite talent. So, in order to not spend so fast, but also to spend fast enough to walk that tightrope, I came up with the par sheet, I don't know, like 15 years ago, where I want to go down every single roster spot that I'm going to have to fill and put an exact dollar amount that I want to spend on that spot. And I'm going to make sure that it adds up to $200. Now, I know that some people say, well, that handcuffs you because you don't want to think about exactly what you want to spend. And I say, quite the contrary, because I'm not telling you that if you write down, I want $28 for my wide receiver two, that you have to spend 28. And if it goes over 28, don't spend that. It's actually the opposite. That 28 gives you a nice little target. And then hey, I can either bid a little bit more or a little bit less based on what I've done on the other spots on my team. So a perfect example of this is a lot of times people will say, well, I want to spend 40% of my roster on my wide receivers. Okay. Well, what does 40% work out to? That works out to about $80. And then they get in a draft and they say, hey, I landed Tyreek Hill for 52. That's great. And then they don't realize that leaves them with $28 to fill the rest of their wide receivers because they only allotted 40%. Now, maybe the number was wrong, but that's not the point here. The point is, when you have that par sheet in front of you, you realize, hey, that 52 for Hill probably is too much based on what I wanted to spend. So rather than saying, hey, 40%, for the folks who are either starting out or never used a par sheet, I think it's going to open your eyes to making the draft a little bit easier and it takes away some of the guesswork in the middle of the draft. Because what you're doing is saying, hey, okay, I wanted to spend 48 on my wide receiver one. I ended up spending 52 for Hill. Now I'm $4 behind. So let's say that A.J. Brown then comes up and he starts to slow down in the mid 30s. Now you had 28 listed for what you want to spend for your wide receiver two, but now Brown's slowing down in the mid 30s and you're thinking, oh, that's a great deal. If you didn't have the par sheet in front of you, you're going to say, I got to jump in on this because that's too cheap for Brown. But if you're looking at your par sheet and your plan of attack, you're saying, man, I really can't. I've already overspent on my wide receiver one. I'm behind the game. I can't afford to bid $36 on A.J. Brown, even if it is a good deal. Because one of the things we have to get used to as auction drafters is we're going to have to pass up some deals. We can't take every deal. We want 90 players. We're only going to get 16. So we have to get comfortable with passing on some of those deals. And somebody without a par sheet might yell out 36 for A.J. Brown and then not realize the big mistake. And so the par sheet keeps you on track and keeps you moving because you're going to keep track of what you spent as you go and whether you're ahead or behind on your sheet to tell you what you can spend. And I think the last point I would make about the par sheet is that the act of putting those dollars down and giving you an exact number, first of all, it tells you how important each dollar is, because I don't think people realize that when they start bidding at the beginning of a draft. So that preparation helps you. But then on top of that, the act of making the par sheet really tunes in your brain to what the value should be for your plan of attack. And so when you get into the draft, you've already kind of got that stuff. So the par sheet's there, but it's that thing where when you did the prep, maybe the par sheet wasn't as necessary after you did it. Of course, I like having it in front of me, and that's what I do, and that's what I advise. But the actual preparation gives you the mental framework to handle yourself in the big moments.
I think that's really good stuff, Drew. I really do. And I kind of want to parlay that into talking about this year in particular and maybe specific strategies we have for this year. And the thing about this, and I'm sure you would agree here, the auction strategies from year to year can kind of stay the same. So there's probably going to be some overlap from our discussion last year, but I always do end up coming up with kind of a cog that I like, that I alluded to. And this year is at the quarterback position. Last year it was kind of at the running back position. There was a couple mid-round running backs I really loved. One of which was Rachaad White that allowed me to spend down at running back. That helped me last year. This year, I have a specific quarterback strategy, Drew, and I'm going to run it past you, and we can talk about the quarterback position at large. And I want to focus on one quarterback auction league. Superflex is a different discussion because the quarterback position is vastly more important. In the last number of years, I was more willing to get into the elite quarterback bidding. Now, the first thing I would do is see where the bidding is, because you're going to be in one of two types of rooms. A room where people are going to spend up for Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts and maybe push them to the $30, $35 range, or a room where everybody's like, oh, I can get my quarterback. And Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts are all of a sudden in the $15, $20 range, and you're much more willing to get into that bidding here. But I have a pretty key strategy. I am going to monitor the market for the elite quarterbacks. Lamar, Hurts, Allen. I'm not even sure Mahomes should be in that discussion because he was 14th in fantasy points per game last year, but we'll put him in that discussion. Anthony Richardson. I'm going to watch the market on those guys. But this year, if the money is too much, I have an easy pivot. My strategy at the quarterback position will be built around Caleb Williams and Jaden Daniels, because we've kind of solved the cheat code quarterback, right? For Jalen Hurts' breakout year, everybody identified him as the breakout. He wasn't going in the 11th round the way Lamar Jackson was, the year Lamar won MVP, or Josh Allen in the 12th, the year Josh Allen really broke out. Jalen Hurts, people identified him. But now there's so many guys up top that can run. Hurts, Allen, Lamar, Richardson, that now these two rookie quarterbacks, Caleb and Jaden Daniels, who can provide value with their legs, are going as low-end QB1s or even high-end QB2s by ADP. And that leads me to a point about the quarterback position. I will get a value at the position, whether that's getting Jalen Hurts for $15 when he should have gone for $25, or I end up getting Jaden Daniels for $3, I am getting a value, because even if the room you're in is quarterback drunk and people are spending $30 on Anthony Richardson when there's no reason for them to do that, that does nothing to the low end of the pool, because eventually even the most aggressive quarterback spenders in your one quarterback league are going to run out of money to spend on that position, and there will be value. So if I'm going to get a running quarterback this year. You can even throw Kyler Murray into the Jaden Daniels, Caleb Williams tier, because he might slip through the cracks a little bit and go for $4 or $5. Those guys are so critical to my strategy, because Caleb Williams could come out and win Rookie of the Year with a great receiving core. By the way, he can add value with his legs. Jaden Daniels, at worst, is going to be Justin Fields for fantasy. Somebody who, at worst, he's going to be somebody who can't throw, but is going to run like crazy. And you can pair Jaden Daniels for $4 with Kirk Cousins for $1 in every draft you do. So those guys are key to my strategy. I will monitor the safer quarterbacks. We know Josh Allen's going to score 1 million points. We don't know that about Jaden Daniels. But if those guys go anywhere near market value, I'm out. I'm pivoting to Caleb. I'm pivoting to Daniels. And if I want to back up, I'm going to have a $1 backup I feel good about. I will get value at the quarterback position this year. It's just a matter of where that value comes from. And that's one of my key strategies for 2024.
Well, I think you said it really well. And you said right where my mind is at as well, because last year I started to key into the fact that there are certain leagues where the quarterbacks, people just don't care as much. One of those was Kings Classic last year. When you are in a room with a bunch of analysts, and I say this all the time about auctions, leagues have a personality. Individual players have personality, but so do leagues in general. And you can count on some of that personality coming through, and that should be part of your prep. And one of the things I said last year going into Kings Classic was, if I can get an elite quarterback in the low 20s, I'm going to try to do it. Now, that happened to be Patrick Mahomes, and that did not work out. But the point being, the strategy was there correctly, that I ended up getting him in the low 20s where I wanted to get him. That's a league personality thing. So I think your idea of the pivot is right where I've been at, because there are leagues in which I feel like I can get a real difference maker in maybe the upper teens, $15 to $18 range. And even if not, it's so deep this year that you can take a chance on one of the running quarterbacks, like you said, And then you're still going to get a guy like you can go get a Jared Goff or a Trevor Lawrence or somebody like that that can back up your guy. So there are so many ways that you can go into an auction and get two quarterbacks you like for $6 or less in an auction. And I absolutely love that strategy. And that's how I build most of my par sheets, is building in no more than $6-7 for both of my quarterbacks. I'm going to have a par sheet where I go after an elite one, but when I pivot, yeah, $6 or less, I'm looking to spend maybe $4 on my QB1 and $2 on my QB2, and I feel great about that.
Let's pivot over to the running back position, talking with Drew Davenport of Football Guys, the Auction Brief podcast. And when people go stars and scrubs, and that's a term thrown around when you draft like 2 or 3 really high-end guys and you waste all your money there. I don't want to say waste, but you spend all your money there, and then the rest of your roster is like, $5 and under. But if you're going to get McCaffrey, Bijan, Breece Hall, it stands to reason you may be going stars and scrubs because of the price tag that those guys are going to go. So we know they're going to be elevated. Those are kind of the marquee big ticket items. They're the PlayStation 5 on Christmas this year. I want to look at, because I am notoriously cheap. You can ask my wife and children. I like, shopping maybe more. You can go to Neiman Marcus. I'll go to Target. Maybe I'll wander around Walmart. And I want to talk about Derrick Henry. I want to talk about James Cook. I want to talk about Ramondre. Guys I think you can get for a fair price. And I'd rather have 2 of them than one Christian McCaffrey, and then my second back is Austin Eckler. That's just kind of how I'd rather roll. How do you approach the running back position this year? Are there any mid-level guys that you're kind of keying in on?
Yeah, so I'll kick this off. First and foremost, I generally, this is not to a T, but I generally will prefer a 0 RB or hero RB strategy in an auction. I prefer that in kind of a snake draft too. I just feel like there's more middle round value wide receivers who are going to go for just cheaper money, and I can coalesce a lot of money at the high end of the wide receiver position, knowing that I'm also going to get good depth receivers. And then I can focus on picking off Derrick Henry for $1 or $2 extra. The guy who I've really identified, Drew, not to say that this is a 0 RB guy, I really identified Isaiah Pacheco this year as somebody who I feel great about as an RB1 on a team where I'm loaded at receiver, because he was like a really underrated bell cow at the end of last season, including getting targets. I'm just far more likely, Drake, to do a 0 RB or hero RB approach. And I guess a 0 RB would be around Isaiah Pacheco. Hero would be more around Bijan and Scrubs, or even JT or Saquon and Scrubs. But Pacheco is a guy I've really identified. That's just the way, Drew, I prefer to build teams right now. I do not want to leave my auction without one of my top 8 wide receivers, and maybe even 2 of them this year. And that's just my personal preference for this year. And the way to do that is to go more of a 0 RB approach.
Well, I know the shows are more fun when we disagree and maybe yell at each other, but I agree, because I've been building my auctions that way for several years now, because I just don't feel comfortable. And to your point, Brian, originally in the question, I don't feel comfortable grabbing the top of any positional group in general. So I'm not going to be the guy who has the number 1 guy at any one position, probably. And I say probably, it's possible through different circumstances, but in general, I don't like the way my build looks when I grab that top guy. And specifically at running back, to your point, I am almost never going to be in on one of the top 2, 3, 4 running backs in my auctions. It comes down to, for me, I feel like you can build value at the running back spot so much easier. And the 2 guys I isolated last year were Pacheco and ETN. Ended up with both of them on quite a few of my auction teams. That worked out well. But this year, a guy you mentioned in the lead up is James Cook. And you also mentioned Derrick Henry. So I wouldn't call that a 0 running back, because those guys are ranked high enough. They're still top 12 running backs in ADP right now. But they're cheap enough that I was in a mock the other day where Derrick Henry went for like $23, and then the other day he went for like 31. And I'm thinking to myself, I can build a team around that price point. That's fine. But the other thing, and I hate to hammer on this too much, the other thing I love about the par sheet is when I'm coming up with my numbers, the one thing that I love about it is when I get into the heat of the moment and I realize, okay, I'm going to have to spend more on these wide receivers than I wanted. I know that when I trimmed my numbers down on my sheet beforehand, like what was most important and what was least important in my brain, because I took money from those spots first. And most often I find that I can cut that at running back. Because, like I said, there's just a monstrous tier of RB2s that I feel like have spike week upside that I can just grab them for 18 or 21 or something like that as my RB1. And if I can get James Cook or Derrick Henry for a reasonable price, that's going to be my RB1. And then I'm going to completely dump out of the RB2. I want a guy who's going to be $8 to $12 at the most at my RB2 spot because I just don't care enough. And you can that the replaceability from the wire is just so much easier at the RB2 spot because of just volume consideration. You know, hey, a guy's going to pop up in week 13 that suddenly we never thought about that's going to get 25 touches this week. And that's just so much easier to do that I'm going to focus on those pass catchers. I'm going to focus on either a top quarterback or a top tight end, one or the other, not both. And then I'm just going to dump out of my RB2 and try to go cheap at my RB1 if possible.
Let me just go back to Drake because you mentioned stars and scrubs. I'm just going to throw auctions can work in any way. And that's the beauty of them, the way you can build your roster. But I'm just going to throw this to any novice or amateur auction player here. Don't do it. Like, just don't do the stars and scrubs thing, because can it work? Of course. If you had Christian McCaffrey last year and CeeDee Lamb last year and you picked the right guys, yeah, you probably ended up or could end up winning your league. But here's the problem. Guys get hurt. They get hurt every year. And if you go stars and scrubs, your team, one injury, even Travis Kelce last year, he turned it on in the playoffs last year. But if you spent $50 on him, you probably weren't feeling great about that investment because there's so much downside there. So
Yeah,
just don't do it. It can work. Your margin for error is way too wide. I'm not going to get into that. And that leads me to another question, Drew, because my strategy at tight end is typically go big or go home. I'm not sure that's the right call this year because
It's different.
To me, I'm not in the Travis Kelce business this year. I understand how stupid that can make me look, but personally, Travis Kelce, he inherited the throne from Gronk, right? That tight end who was so elite that he was 2 tiers above the next guy. That wasn't the case last year. And I'm not in the Travis Kelce business this year because I think I've started to coin a phrase. I think the Chiefs are going to use him as a smart time player. I'm not telling you that he's going to be a part-time guy who's running 50% of his routes, but I think the Chiefs acknowledge right now the only thing that really matters for them is winning the Super Bowl. Travis Kelce's already a Hall of Famer. He's already broken records. The only thing that matters for the Chiefs is winning the Super Bowl. And healthy Travis Kelce in January is way more important to them doing that than healthy Travis Kelce in October. And that leads to the question, is Sam Laporta or Trey McBride ready to ascend to the tier unto himself tight end? And I'm not sure I'm there with those. I like those guys this year. I've drafted a lot of McBride, especially on Kyler teams, but I'm not sure I'm there. They're not Gronkian yet. Laporta might become that, but I don't think I'm there with those guys. So I might actually be focusing more on the middle round tight ends or the middle tier tight ends, of which I've highlighted kind of Evan Ingram as my guy. How do you feel about tight end this year, Drew?
Well, I think you make a great point about Gronk at the end of his career, Gronk v. Kelce there, because at the end of Gronk's career, they were using him in a similar fashion. Lower snap shares, more high leverage situations. I think we could see that a lot with Kelce this year. So I'm in agreement with you about your Kelce take. And also there's just more target competition, but we're not here to talk about Kelce's prospects. In general, the tight end spot this year is significantly different for me than it has been in the past couple of years, because I either wanted to get one or two guys in the previous years, or I just didn't want to spend anything. I mean, I came out of several drafts last year with two $1 tight ends, and I just don't care because I was spending money in other spots. And again, tight end is that thing that can pop off the wire sometimes, and that you can play a little bit of streaming games with tight end as well. So, but I think this year has changed a little bit because of the depth at the position. There are 5 or 6 guys that I'm okay with. And I even feel like a guy like David Njoku is getting a little bit disrespected. He's a little bit cheaper than he should be. So I'm willing to spend a few bucks. And so what I think what my alternative plan is going to be, I haven't fully mapped it out, but I really believe that I'm going to go in thinking that if I can spend 14 to 16 on one of these guys, I'm going to be pretty happy about that. And if that doesn't happen, I'm totally cool because I still feel like I can get a guy from $4 to $7 that's going to be a really good player, a Jake Ferguson, David Njoku, something like that. I think the pivot is much easier this year because of the depth. So I'm going to try. I'm never a guy who's going to be like $23 for Mark Andrews. That's just not me because it doesn't fit my builds in general. So I think I'm going to look at, can I get Mark Andrews for $18? Can I get one of these guys for 14, 15, 16, whatever? And if not, I'm cool spending 4 to 7 on a guy like Ferguson or Njoku.
Yeah, you mentioned Mark Andrews, and he's a guy alongside Evan Ingram that I've been targeting a ton. Mark Andrews last year, again, only played in 10 games, but 13.5 points per game. That was good enough for 4th among tight ends in PPR. And he just kind of seems to be lost in the sauce. He's, because he was hurt, kind of out of sight, out of mind. So that's a guy on draft day. See if you can get a value on Andrews or even Ingram. So before we get you out of here, Drew, any other kind of maybe nomination strategies or things that our drafters should know when they're walking into their draft rooms this year? And even if you're sitting at home and you're just drafting at your kitchen table, some things you want drafters to know, because Lord knows you can kind of start playing on your phone. You can start drinking. Your kids are talking. Things happen in these drafts. Just kind of final thoughts here on the auction brief from the auction, a fantasy football lawyer, our king of the auction here, Drew Davenport.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that I want to stress more than anything this year is that pressure and precision are the name of the game for me. And that's what I've been pushing on my show all summer, that you want to put the maximum amount of pressure on your league mates with the most amount of precision possible. And the way that I explain that is fairly straightforward. If you force other people to make difficult decisions over and over and over and over, they're going to make mistakes. And the person who makes the most mistakes is going to have the worst results than you. So, and the precision part comes in where I really believe people have trouble telling themselves that there are ways that we can control our auction room. And so I think sometimes people think to themselves, well, things are going to happen, or things, it's going to get scarce, or it's going to be this or that. And people feel like they don't have a lot of control, but you do. And there are things that you can do as you work your way through the auction that make your plan come together the way you want it to come together. And I think, unfortunately, for a lot of people, this seems like a boring point, but your preparation is so huge. And I alluded to it earlier in the show. It isn't really about like, I know this player should be $41. That's not what it's about. The preparation of walking through your tiers, of walking through your par sheet and what you want to spend, of walking through your plan of attack. It isn't about the fact that you're going to get in the auction and you're going to have those exact things go that way, because no, we can't control that stuff. But what can we control? We can control our mindset and our framework, our mental framework that comes from that preparation. And then when we get into the auction, don't waste the moments to have to push things the way you want them to go. And one of the biggest things I always say is early in the auction, don't waste your nominations. You can do that in the middle of the auction. You want to waste people's money, do that in the middle of the auction. At the beginning of the auction, I want you to focus on what are the guys that you think are going to be cornerstones for your team. Do you think, hey, I'm going to go after Sam Laporta? Okay, well, get him out there right away. Nobody's going to forget about Sam Laporta, okay? He's going to get nominated. And you're not going to get a deal on Sam Laporta this year. So just get him out there and figure out whether or not you're going to get him. If he doesn't come until the 4th round, you've already passed up a lot of players that you could have landed on your team when you need to pivot. The pivots become harder the deeper you get into the auction. So define your path early and control what you can control. And you can control your nominations, and you can control your plan of attack and your preparation ahead of time. All of that stuff gives you a framework that it's the old saying of military folks. When you get into a firefight, you have a plan, and it's never going to be what happens in the middle of a firefight when the bullets start flying. And that's what happens in an auction. You're going to have a plan. It's never going to go the way you want it to go. The preparation is what allows you to pivot and still succeed when you get in that hot moment.
So, Drake, I'm going to put off a couple of bullet points this year. Number one, and this is important for especially even veteran auction drafters, do not get into a bidding war for a player you don't want or don't need.
I love it. Thank you.
Do not do it. Even if you're the most extreme example is getting in a bidding war for a quarterback who, when you already have one and you're like, oh, this quarterback going for way too cheap, and then you get saddled with them. Because here's two things. Number one, not only is your budget finite, so are your roster spots. You have two forms of currency in an auction draft, and both of them are finite. So if you get saddled with a player you don't want, not only do you have fewer dollars to spend on a player you do want, but you don't even have the room to put that player on your roster, because you can't cut a player during an auction draft. It doesn't work that way. So your roster spots and your budget are finite. So don't get into a bidding war for a player you don't want or can't afford just because somebody else gets a value. If somebody else gets a value on a player you don't need, golf clap and move on. Yep. Save your money for maybe getting a value you do need. And here is another tip right here. Here's number two. Do not spend more than $1 on a kicker or a defense. Do not do it. It's dumb. Maybe you can do it at the end of your draft. If you have just your defense spot and you have $2 left over, that's fine then. Don't do it. I actually like to nominate defenses early because, number one, if I throw out a defense that has a great early season schedule and everybody's like, oh, boring, he nominated a defense, and then you let me get my preferred defense, great, I'll get him for $1. If somebody bids on him, great, you just spent $2 and now have one fewer dollar for the end of your draft. And that leads me to the end of your draft for your last roster spot or your last two roster spots. Say there's that sleeper, and every August and September, those sleepers are going to emerge from training camp. The drum beat's getting louder. This rookie's going to have a bigger role than ever or something like that. Let's just say you have two roster spots and you really want Luke Musgrave, the tight end from the Packers, and you have $4 left to spend. You nominate Luke Musgrave for $2. Or you nominate him for $1. Somebody comes above and goes to $2. And then somebody goes, oh, $3 on Luke Musgrave. Well, you've screwed yourself because your $4 budget can cover that, but you have two roster spots you have to fill. So you did not make your maximum allowed bid. With your last roster spot or two, especially with a player you really want, put your max bid out there. And if somebody beats your max bid, so be it. But you do not want to get caught in a budgeting problem where you didn't make your max bid, somebody matched your max bid, and now you screwed yourself out of a player you really wanted. So those are some of the tips that can really get you over the hump with your auction draft. Anyway, that's my spiel. Believe me, it's happened to me. It's happened to me. So that's how I come up with our auction plan.
Drew, what else you got?
Love it. I cannot stress enough. Late in the draft, maybe we can bring this full circle right here, because you let off the show asking about each dollar and how important the dollars are. At the end of or keeping track of people's dollars, that's what goes down at the end of the draft. You have to know those people's bids. And if some guy or girl is sitting there and they have a $2 max bid, and you start out your player at 1 and they say 2, then you ended up paying 3. Well, what's the point of that? Just bid 2 and you've shut them out. So you have to pay attention to those little things that save you $1 here and there. And if you do that a couple times during the draft, you're working up a $3 or $4 player that you wouldn't have otherwise had if you weren't paying attention. And also the kicker and D thing, totally on board. I yell at my people all the time. Do not spend more than $1 on a kicker and D. Just don't do it.
And a lot of folks don't realize that. They're like, just sitting back listening. They go, wait a minute. So you only have 2. You throw them out for 2. You have to beat someone's bid. You can't match the bid. And that is just such a point that people don't realize. And I'm glad you guys brought that up. So if you got a guy, you want him for 2, that's all you can spend is 2, say 2. And also goes back to the stars and scrubs concept, where I have seen numerous times. Now you got, your stars at the top, but you're just wasting away. You're bored out of your mind at the end of the draft because you can't spend any more money. Your next 3 roster spots are all $1 guys. And now you're not getting the players that you want. You're basically just waiting until everybody's player is off the board and you're getting the bottom of the barrel scraps. So it's yet another reason maybe to not go stars and scrubs. Well, what a great 45, 50 minutes here of auction talk. Joe, great stuff. Your work over at Fantasy Points is up, and the cheat sheets, the value auction chart is there. Drew, make sure you give him a follow at Drew Davenport FF, and he's got his great podcast, The Auction Brief. Whew, boy, this is exciting. I'm ready to go do some drafting tonight, boys.
I need a cigarette.
Yeah, really? Well, you got a bad cough. You would get that under control over there.
I don't smoke, so I'm just using a euphemism. But,
yeah. So for Drew Davenport, for Joe Dolan, I'm Brian Drake. We'll see you next time on Fantasy Points Now.